All right, we are live. Hi, Chris and Becca.
Hey, Adam.
Hi, Adam.
How are you guys doing?
We're doing really well, thank you.
Good. Well, I'm very excited for us to be kicking off our new webinar capabilities here in 2017. We had done a really brief test of this back at the end of last year, but as you guys know, we've spent a lot of time over the past number of months getting this platform up and ready to be doing new types of webinars like these, and very excited to get this going. Hello to everybody watching us. Hope you guys are well. Got a great program here scheduled today. Chris and Becca are going to be talking about relatively newish territory for us here at Peak Prosperity. As Chris wrote about in his piece the other week, he did a really good job of sort of encapsulating what we focus on here at Peak Prosperity. And it's really sort of three main areas. It's the knowing, it's the doing, and it's the being. And the knowing is a lot of the content that we write about on a daily basis at Peak Prosperity. It's what's happening in the world. It's all the data that's in the crash course. The doing is in the 8 forms of capital and a lot of the guidance that's been recommended through our book Prosper. And then once you've taken all those steps, you've learned what you need to learn, and you've taken a lot of individual steps in your life, it really becomes a question of who do you want to be as we step into this future. And of course, as we're waiting for that future to unfold, there's all sorts of issues that we juggle on a regular basis. You know, how do we deal with the phenomenon of living 2 lives? You know, if we are waiting for all this collapse to happen and we just want it to hurry up, you know, what do we do in the meantime? Lots and lots of questions around that. How do we talk about this information with other people in our lives? So that's what we're going to be focusing on in this first webinar here. So if you've got questions about gold or the Federal Reserve or what to do with your stock portfolio, just want to set expectations accurately. Those aren't going to be very much addressed in this webinar, but certainly we'll be addressing them in future ones coming forward. So without further ado, I want to hand the baton to Chris and Becca. And guys, take it away from here. Oh, I'm sorry. Before I let you guys go, I see people are saying hello in the chat window there, which is great, and it's nice to see you all. We will be using that chat window quite liberally at some point here later on in the podcast. Chris and Becca will be taking Q&A directly from you. So we're going to let them talk for a bit and sort of set the stage, and then I'll pop back on and help pick questions that folks are asking. So if you're here and you've got a burning question to ask, you will get a chance to ask it, and I will do my best to see if we can't actually get it answered. So with that said, off to you, Chris and Becca.
All right. Thank you, Adam. And thank you, everybody, for listening and watching at this. I'm Chris Martenson, of course, and this is
Becca.
Becca Martenson. And look, we've been doing this, meaning presenting this information and material for a little over 10 years now. And as those of you who read the recent piece on the site and also have been listening carefully between the lines in the podcast, you know that for a while, what I've really been doing has been pushing at this idea that there's a third big area to investigate. And it's been a really important part of my life, and it's around the being. So the knowing was the crash course. That came out first, really important to have that knowing. There's lots of other knowings out there that I'm very interested in building and bringing forward to the world, things that we might know and learn from each other about, including things that relate to, the loss of privacy or where things are going geopolitically or what science is coming up with. There's we're a learning organization. But that part intact, we're going to keep doing that. We're going to keep information scouting, absolutely critical. But as you know, the knowing without the doing that just makes you uncomfortable. Well, it does me. And so the doing was the part that, we did our first, remember the first row seminar we did?
Oh, yeah. That was 11 years ago.
11 years ago. All right. So more than 10 years. And the first questions, like everybody showed up.
Oh, yeah.
And we actually showed people how to store food.
Yep. They wanted to hold gold in their hands.
Hold gold.
What does it look like?
Well, I still do. But but it was really tactical.
Yeah.
And over time, we've noticed either people are self-selecting or we're far enough along in the story now that once you do some of the basics in doing, right? So you take care of food, shelter, warmth, your finances, you get those squared away.
As best you can.
Best you can. Obviously an ongoing process, but you have those minimally or sufficiently taken care of. And the next question is, well, now what?
Yeah.
And I'm at a stage of my life where it turned out that being was this next big stage for me. And it turns out that everything I've investigated. So for those of you who who were our subscribers and saw the comment section, somebody had really challenged me and said, hey, what's with all this being stuff? I like the financial information. Is that going away? And the answer is no, this is an and, not an or.
Right.
We're going to be doing this and the other material. And for me, I've come to this conclusion that if we're really going to do the mission at Peak Prosperity, if I'm really going to live into this mission, which I'm going to, the mission is creating a world worth inheriting. And my dedication that sits right under that is to all of life. Humans, sure, but all of life, bumblebees, everything. If we're really going to live into that mission, what needs doing? And if you've watched The Rules for Rulers, or you've really studied geopolitics or history, you understand that even if you had a big revolution and you swept everybody out and you installed all new people, you'd probably still end up with the same results, because what hasn't happened is we still have that same basic operating system, the same consciousness. As Einstein would say, we're gonna be replacing old thinking that got us into trouble with the same old thinking, but just in different form. So the being turns out to be a really critical part of the story for me, which is that unless we really change how we're inhabiting this world, I don't think the mission I'm pursuing happens. And so for me, that meant because I can't talk about anything till I've gone through it myself. It's part of my own personal ethos, and been doing a lot of inner work and inner exploration and changing of myself. Much of it with the very exquisite honing and help of Becca, who actually has been leading me in this regard for a long time.
You women will be shocked to hear that.
I know. We boys do grow up, but it takes a while. And so that led me to a really startling conclusion, which was some really interesting, like super fascinating stuff in my life, which was that as I changed myself inside, my whole experience of the world shifted around me. The people in my life started reacting to me differently, not because I was really saying anything differently, but because I was being different.
Yeah.
And so that leads to, these things that I'd read, but I've seen them etched in little stones and on t-shirts, like, as within, so without.
Right.
Be the change you wish to see. Trite statements, but it turned out they're true.
Who'd have thunk?
So, and I've got a lot more to say around that, but that's the basic intro, is that this being part is absolutely critical to the mission, and the knowing, the doing, the being, any one of them insufficient on their own, and they all build on each other. And this is an area that it's new to Peak Prosperity, but it's not new to me. It's not new to Becca. We've been going down this path for quite a long time. Have a lot of things to offer in this regard. And for those of you who have come to Row, you've seen what we have to offer around the areas of speaking with reluctant partners, how to build community, what it really means to build your social capital. At Row this year, we got a little further into the emotional capital and how we actually, what does that mean? How would you build emotional capital? So these are all areas that actually we have quite a lot of experience in. And the question has always been, when and how do we bring this out? So before I go any further, why don't you introduce yourself to anybody who doesn't know who you are?
All right. Well, I want to say hello to everybody who's signed on. It makes me so happy to see all of these names popping up on the chat, and all of the different locations all over the country and all over the world that are watching. So I just want to say a very warm hello to you all. It's really a pleasure to be here. So Chris and I have been, journeying together for the past 31 years, and the past 14 years we have been up in this area, up in Western Massachusetts, having taken a very big turn in our life towards resiliency and building community. So while Chris has been out working very much nationally and globally on bringing his message to the world, my focus has been very local, extremely local. So I have been really the one at home building local community. We've been homeschooling our children for the past 15 years. That's been predominantly my responsibility, as well as I have a real passion for supporting children and adults in their relationship to the natural world. So I've been working for an organization called the Vermont Wilderness School as well for a decade. and also building a private practice doing personal counseling and coaching. So, this has just kind of been me behind the scenes here while you've been doing your work out in the public. I've been kind of, with the exception of coming to Row and all of the people that I have just adored getting to know at Row over the years, I've been in the background, basically building social capital.
And a lot of inner work and inner journeying.
Oh, yeah.
And Becca has her own practice in helping people go in and discover things inside themselves. And all of that really starts with being a fierce inner warrior. This is where it started.
Yes, the courage to be with how we are. It's not easy. It's really not easy at all. But, as you practice over time, it's so fruitful that it's worth it. Promise.
And so as many of you know, this whole area of really beginning to inquire into how we are and how we're built. As I say about the 8 forms of capital, I honestly think emotional capital is the most important one, because you could be rich in all 7 other forms of capital, but if you fall apart when the trouble starts, or when things become more difficult,
or if you're just miserable,
like why bother, right? So then they're all for naught, right? So you can get by without financial capital. There's ways to do that. You can get by without cultural capital. There's things you can do there. But if you personally don't have emotional capital, that one's a real deal breaker. And by the statistics, right, we see that there's very low in the United States. So I see people logging in from Italy and Australia and Peru and New Zealand.
Canada.
My goodness. So maybe your experience is different, but here in the United States, where we market and sell fear to ourselves, both politically and on the retail level, there's a lot of statistics that are troubling with respect to opioid addiction and levels of reported unhappiness, people saying they're leading 2 lives. They feel like they have a fraudulent sort of experience.
Alcoholism, drug abuse.
All of that. Those are all examples of today people are living with low emotional capital, to the point that suicides are now the leading cause of a non-natural death in the United States.
It's not a good sign. It's really not a good sign.
And the tragedy behind that, of course, is that this life is one of the most extraordinary things you can do. This is like it's a hologram, 4-dimensional, with incredibly
go all woo on them, Chris.
with incredibly high screen refresh rate and very high resolution. It's astonishing. No, this is the scientist in me. So here's something a lot of people don't. Excuse me, it wasn't an earthquake. I kicked it. Is a scientist, something I did was I spent day after day looking through a very high-powered microscope at living cells. And we could see these cells under such high resolution that when I looked at individual cells, they looked like cities from about 8,000 feet in the middle of the day, with cars and trucks and activity. And
so cool.
And seeing that each one of these cells was this amazing, complex, living organism was astonishing.
Somebody just give you a thumbs up on the hologram.
Awesome. Because that's what it is. So I have a real awe embedded in me about what it means to even like an appreciation and gratitude. This whole thing called life is here.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's an amazing thing. So the key to getting back to that awe, that gratitude, that joy, that sense of purpose is to get out of the human side of the story into the misery side that you just mentioned, to get out of that framework and to come into an expanded view. So when I say consciousness, what I'm really talking about for me is getting away from what I'm going to call my pre-programmed responses, things where it's like stimulus response. You poke the earthworm and it retracts. Like when somebody would give me a poke and I would retract, right? I spent a lot of my life, I think, in stimulus response. And so a big piece of my progression, I know somebody asked a question like, what are the tools you use? A big one for me was separating my reactions from my responses. Now, the reactions still happen. People poke at me and my insides churn and I get a little clenched up, but I can separate that from my response now, get a little gap between those two things. And so that's been a really important tool for me as I come into this place. So when I say consciousness, what I'm referring to in this story is the ability to really be present with what our actual responses are going to be, and to have those be as thoughtful as we can have them be,
Okay.
rather than reactionary.
All right. That sounds good.
All right.
So should we get some questions from Adam?
Yeah. Hey, Adam, what kind of, let's go to questions now. I know we had a lot on the being side, and we heard, we got a lot of questions. And
oh my God, so many. I was really excited.
I know. We have so much material. There's going to be tons of material.
We're going to do a lot of podcasts.
I hope so. They came in a lot of big buckets. And so there were some that were in the financial buckets. We won't be able to get to those today. There are some on building community, some on relationships, some on living with fear, how to manage fear, some on being, things like that. So we're kind of going to select from just a couple of those buckets today and draw upon those and see if we can get a thread going here.
Great. Yeah. So you're right. We got over 300 questions submitted, which I think if we gave each one 5 seconds, we probably still wouldn't make in the hour we have here. So I pulled out a couple ones that I think are kind of emblematic of a lot of the questions that folks wanted to get answers to. And then I'm going to invite the folks who are listening in this chat window here, as you guys have questions that you would like to have Chris and Becca address, please start posting them. I'm not sure I'll be able to get to all of them with the volume that we might have, but I will do my absolute best to pull ones out that I think are ones that the entire audience will be most interested in hearing. So again, please feel free to fire away with any questions. All right, Chris and Becca. So let's see here. You touched on this a tiny bit, Chris, but I did think this was just a great question that was posed. Chris and Becca, what personal practice has helped you the most in means of growth in the area of being? So in terms of your own personal practices, what tools, what approaches are you finding work best for you to, fully manifest in this being state you're talking about?
We're told to sit up, so we're going to sit up. There we go. Is that better?
Yeah.
All right.
So why don't you start?
All right. Okay. So practices on being. Well, I want to start with the 2 G's, which I think are really essential. Number one is gratitude, and number 2 is grounding. Either order is fine. When I say grounding, what I mean is really feeling myself in my body. Because a lot of times what happens in our world when there's so much stimulus, there's so much doing, there's so much going on, is that we kind of rise up. You can kind of see it in people's body posture. Their shoulders rise up. And so grounding just allows the energy to settle down. And a lot of times I'll just go outside and put my feet on the earth, bare feet on the earth, and really feel my feet and feel my connection to the earth. The practice of grounding is super important, especially when you're stirred up, when you're feeling anxious. I mean, this is essential. So many questions that we had are around like, well, what do I do? How can I be when I'm so afraid all the time? I mean, this is a scary, potential future coming. And I don't know how to be in the present moment with the amount of fear that I'm feeling. And what I always tell people when there's anxiety and fear is start by grounding. Get your feet on the ground and bring your energy into your body as much as you can. A second super important practice for me is gratitude. And this brings me into the present moment in such a visceral way. And when I'm talking about gratitude, I'm not thinking of just like a list of things. Oh, I'm grateful for my health and for my family. But when I go into gratitude, I really like sink into myself and feel like in this moment, what am I honestly, genuinely feeling really deeply grateful for? And the process of doing that, the process of just feeling into my own gratitude. Number one, it's grounding in itself. And number two, it just shifts my energy pretty much right away. So those are very simple, very, very simple practices. And the third one that I want to throw in is just saying hello to whatever I'm feeling. So if the feeling is stirred up, if the feeling is anxious, if the feeling is angry, if the feeling is joyful, whatever the feeling is, I just notice like, oh yeah, I'm feeling really anxious right now. I'm feeling really angry right now. I'm feeling really elated right now. And I just welcome whatever the feelings are without trying to shift them, move them, change them, do anything with them, just as a starting point. Those are some of my go-to beginners.
Great. And Chris will let you answer in a second, but a good clarifying question from Tom. By grounding and by noticing the feelings, you're having them in the moment, is that mindfulness? Or is it different from mindfulness?
It's very related. They're kind of interwoven, I would say. Mindfulness is really bringing yourself into the present moment. I believe that's my definition of it. How can we be fully in the present moment? And sensory meditations are awesome for mindfulness. What am I noticing that I'm hearing right now? How can I feel the breeze on my skin? Can I see the color of the leaves of the trees? So that brings me fully into the present moment. And grounding is really an energetic term, and it's really about being fully in the body. So I think it is possible to be mindful from here up, but grounded is like the whole self.
That sounds like you're saying there's mindful and then there's bodyful, and you want to.
Yeah, there we go.
Yes, and that'll get me to my part, because that's been a super important part of my development. I lived from here up for the first 47 years of my life. And I've since learned that I actually have a body too. And it's been really important to get into that. And so where Becca welcomes, I actually, one of the things that, people often give me this kind of look when I say this, but I've actually welcomed intensity into my life, meaning that I'm looking to expand the range of emotions or feelings that I'm comfortable having in my body.
Or not comfortable.
Sometimes I would call them uncomfortable, but I actually welcome them now because I like the intensity. And so, in accordance with that, I stopped drinking because that's a numbing behavior, was for me. I've really cut out a lot of the numbing behaviors because I want to feel them. I want to be with the experience of them, because to me, that's really the intensity of life, is around being comfortable with what is. And that's an incredible practice. So think about a lot of the questions were basically some version of, this is getting uncomfortable.
Yeah. How can we handle all of this feeling?
How do we be uncomfortable with this? And one way is you try and get away from the uncomfortable feelings, and if that's not possible, and by the way, it's not entirely, and it's going to be increasingly hard, I think, is to figure out how you're going to become comfortable with those. And at first, it sounds a little bit like, oh, I have to get used to sitting on tacks or something, but it's not about that. For me, the more I've stepped into expanding my capability to be with the range of feelings inside, it means that I've been able to experience higher highs, right, along with those so-called lower lows. But it's the paradox of life. So expanding that felt sense is a body thing for me. It's not a mental thing. Right. Where I think a lot of mindfulness practices are billed as, quieting all of this down, and there's tremendous value in that. There's a corollary to that, or a complement to that for me, which is expanding the ability of this thing, the body, to feel those feelings. Remember those reactions I talked about?
I do.
Those come from my body. They just all by themselves. Like, I don't have to make my breathing speed up and my heart speed up and my chest get tight. I don't have to, those just happen automatically. But being comfortable with those has been a really good practice. And that gets us to this. The way I do that is that when those reactions come up, I have to very consciously stop my mind from putting a story on it.
Okay.
And a story might be, that person made me feel this way. That's a story.
And the feeling might be a flutter in your heart or like a clenching or something like that. Yep.
And then to get that separation, that witnessing. So Becca called it welcoming. For me, I have another part of my brain that can just start recording and go, oh, this is pretty intense this time. This is like, look how strong this sensation is. Notice how tight that feels. So it's just getting that separation. And this has been the most important tool I've had in my life, is learning how to separate these things from each other so that I can begin to work with them individually.
And I see one of the questions, Adam, I just want to refer to one of the questions I saw on the side, which is this being with the discomfort of the unknown, of being with the unknown. And I think that is, that's like one of the biggest ones we got to deal with right now, because nobody knows how anything is going to go. And of course, we never have. We may have had the fantasy that we thought we knew how life was going to unfold, but that's not true. And so to be present and be willing to not know, willing to allow the unfolding to happen in front of you. and breathe through it.
Well, that's very germane to this next question here, and one that someone had posted up here as well. You know, how to remain positive and well-adjusted while the wait is killing them in terms of waiting for this whole story to unfold. Somebody down here, Mark, said, you know, given the state of the world, how can one manage personal despair? So for people who are really wrestling with that fear of the future, obviously some of what you talked about, you know, is what they can practice. What other advice would you have for those people?
Well, that's a big one. So there are a lot of dimensions to that one potentially. So here's where it's going to be very, I think, useful. And let me tread carefully here. But to separate this, mine is the masculine, Becca from the feminine. That we can look at this very differently. And I'm using that masculine, feminine, not in a gender way, although that tends to apply a lot. So for me, you know, we talk about in Prosper that fear lives often in that gap between what you know and what you're doing. And so in many ways, some of this fear, the dread, the anxiety are manageable if it turns out they are the result of living in a way or having actions in a way that are not in alignment with what you already know. So for me, you know, I moved to Western Mass with my family, and we got some gardens and chickens, we got the bees and all that. And that all makes me feel good and a nice quality of life. But that was really to help me manage some of that anxiety for myself. And that was one way that I had to do that. So that was me attempting to control what I could. Let me, you know, make some of our own calories and gain some skills and build my capital, living, knowledge, all that stuff. But I'll tell you, if I don't want to pick on anybody, so let me neutralize this. If I lived in a big city that I knew deep down was completely unsustainable, I'm not sure there's enough of that action that could actually make me feel to take that anxiety away. Right. And so some of that anxiousness may be coming from your own local personal situation, right? And then at another level, it might come from the things I don't really know what to do about, which is when I see those horrible articles about the insect populations really just plummeting. You know, that as a scientist, that just gives me the willies, right? So it hurts my heart. So in those circumstances now I have to go into a different process of figuring out how best to release that and to let go of and to manage that fear and anxiety, because it's, you know, there's, as we talk about in the Rose seminar, there's fear that's helpful. You're being chased by a bear. Fear is an awesome thing, right? Gets you up the tree faster if that's an escape route. But then there's fear that becomes paralyzing and worse, degrades your quality of life. You know, it just sits there and erodes your experience. And that's not the point of any of this, is to sit there and have a worse quality of life. You know, hopefully this all leads to a better quality of life today and more resilience for the future. But everything I've just described from that masculine perspective is about controlling, planning, you know, taking, you know, risk adjusting, doing all those things, which are important. But there was a really important question and observation series that came up, including one in the chat side here that said, well, what do you do when you can't know? How can you be comfortable in the not knowing?
Yeah. And I want to loop back to the feeling of despair, because I'm sure many of the people that are listening right now have that experience of the deep despair. It's very, you know, how can one be conscious and awake in this world and not feel despair about what is going on? So this is where we get into my approach, which is going to be, again, more about being with the despair. So, you know, saying hello to the part of you that is despairing. It makes absolute perfect sense that you are feeling deep despair about what is going on. And there's a way, something magical happens when we don't try to chase these things away, when we don't try to diminish or hide from it or wish it wasn't there. But if we can just say hello and welcome the despair, like, yeah, there it is. This is really, really hard sometimes. And give it full space. And this may be where you really need to call in your therapist, call in your friends, call in people to be with you with it. And then you can, I mean, I like to dialogue with these things. So I will, talk to the despair and say, I want to hear you. I want to hear everything you have to say. And then I want to ask if you're willing to sit to the side for now so that I can go back to my life. So there's a way of being deeply, deeply present with what you're feeling. And then asking, if this is willing to sit over to the side for a bit, so that you can then, at that point, like one of the great balms for despair is gratitude. I mean, gratitude can come back in again and again and again whenever you are feeling the anxiety, when you're feeling the fear, when you're feeling the despair. Once you make space for it and allow it to be, if you loop back into what you're feeling deeply grateful for in the moment, it provides an inner shift that just takes the edge off of it a little bit in a way that might free you up a little.
What about the not knowing? I know that Becca has given me
I love not knowing.
many transmissions, and this is one of them where she's actually not only not afraid of unknowing, but she actually welcomes it and actually likes the not knowing.
Knowing is exhausting. I don't like knowing anymore.
Well, how is the not knowing your ally though? I think that's a really important thing to share.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, not knowing is actually a place I visit. Sounds kind of weird. I don't. This languaging might not make sense to you, and if it doesn't, I apologize. But I do spend a lot of time in meditation, and not knowing is a landscape. It's a place that I can visit when I sink in deeply, 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 way down underneath all of the thinking, all of the knowing, to a place of what I think of as the void, the nothingness, a place where there's nothing to know. And that place is a very comfortable place for me. I really like to visit there because when I go down into that place, especially if I'm sitting with a question that I'm trying to figure out what is like the best, most creative response to a particular problem or situation.
Like what? How have you used that lately?
Well, very practically, I'm developing a new website, trying to figure out how to bring out a new body of work that I'm finding my way into. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of weird and complicated and not straightforward. And so I don't know how to turn it into a website. So I'll just take that question into that place and I'll just drop into it and just sit and wait. I just wait and listen and open and allow and wait some more. And then something just kind of bubbles up. And then when I come back up into a place of thinking, there will be this fresh idea that has emerged about, you can design it this way. Here's how you can design the website. And I'll quick write it down and send it off to my web person. So that place of not knowing is, for me, actually very fertile, important territory that I like to visit as much as possible. One thing that I believe is a problem that we're facing on the planet right now is that there's so much of our doing is based on faulty knowing. Like our knowing is kind of bullshit, honestly, in a lot of ways. It's not accurate anymore. And it's based on old systems that are outdated. And so how are we going to create that new material? How are we going to do what Einstein says and access new territory if we're not sinking into a place where we haven't been thinking before? So that's a place that I like to pulse into regularly, just as a practice for me.
So there you
is that too crazy for y'all?
Well, it can be used for web design, so that's pretty tactical.
It can be used for anything. That's the great thing about it.
Right. And so what I wanted to set that up is it's a little bit there are multiple ways to do everything, of course, but grossly speaking, there's sort of masculine and feminine on display, which is the knowing. I'm going to dive in, I'm going to get the details, and then there's the understanding that there's great power in not knowing. Yeah. So I just want to flip around that the uncertainty and the not knowing, it can feel one way, which, you put it over into the masculine side and it's not an asset, but it actually, the not knowing can be an asset. There's permaculture principle of knowing that every problem contains its solution is at play in everything we're talking about in this space, which is that there is no particular thing that doesn't have another side to it. Like, oh my God, that really awful hard experience. Well, that turned out to be the one that made me grow really rapidly. So that in all of this, there's that opportunity for gratitude to come forward, because everything has turned out to have been in service of, or helping in service of growing, if seen that way.
Yeah. I mean, if you ask the question, what am I learning here, of whatever the situation, no matter how horrific it might feel, you have that opportunity to harvest the gifts of the situation, whatever it is. So that's another question that I like to just kind of bring in, especially when it gets gnarly and really dark and hard, is, okay, well, what am I learning? What am I learning?
And what are we creating? So I think that at that void, at the opportunity here is for us to really create our own lives, to really create our futures together, for us to really together figure out how we're going to create whatever's coming next. And so deep down, we all have a lot more power. Well, I have more power than I was led to believe, right? I think coming up in this society, in this culture, says, here's how much power you have. All the power is invested in these people. These are here's how things get done. Here's how things don't get done. But if you read through the memoirs of a lot of extremely creative people, including Einstein, for instance, to quote him twice in one day, he has in his memoirs a thing that said, yeah, I'm pretty humble because it wasn't really me. These things just came from somewhere. Most notably when he was silent, like in the shower or at quiet moments, all of a sudden out of the void for him would come the answer. And then he would have to make sense of it. He's like, oh, I understand space and time. Let me think how I'm going to.
It's a little hard to put into words.
I'm going to write that down.
Linear language.
But that's an opportunity here, which is that, so you found in your life that there's a place you can go to that that taps into that deeper self, which has some answers sometimes.
Frequently.
So I want to stay in that same vein of consciously tapping into yourself and sort of not letting your wiring drive you, but you drive your wiring, with a great question here that Richard asked. In your last piece, Chris, you talked about the importance, both for us as individuals, but as a collective society, to kind of get beyond our egos, right? To not let the ego remain in the driver's seat all the time. So Richard's question is, what helps you actually do this? Because the ego is a powerful force.
Well, that would be the significant other in your life. Children.
How's that going with the ego, hon?
Oh, it's great. I mean, I like to take it out for a tour every so often, a couple laps. So there's a lot of definitions around these things that are probably good to get into. And I don't know that we can really do it justice here, but one thing that I did point out in that article is that the ego, one aspect of the ego is that it's constantly wanting. It's how it's built. It wants. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, the ego is a tool, and I think it's a fabulous tool to have. And I actually permaculturally have sort of understood now that this thing that a lot of people and a lot of spiritual practices say our job is to slay the ego, to lose it, to go beyond it, to, something as if it's this,
distasteful relative.
or an untrained dog, like this thing you'd rather have in another room, unseen and unheard. But the truth is that we live in a universe of contrasts, and the ego is an extraordinarily great way to get a lot of things done and also provide that contrast so that you can understand what it's like to be without it. I mean, what would it be to be just pure consciousness without an ego? I mean, to me, they're the opposites in this story. So to get beyond that wanting, though, is to notice that, if you are, when I was fully enmeshed in my ego, I was constantly in a state of wanting. I wanted to reach more people. I wanted, to get more content out. I wanted, more connections, all these wantings. And one thing that I noticed about my ego is that when it would get to wherever it was trying to get to, it was already on the next thing before I'd even gotten there. Right. So
no satisfaction.
There's no satisfaction, right? Can't get no satisfaction. So the ego is extraordinarily good for some things, but to be completely in its service means to be living a life of never being satisfied, for me. And so, I don't think there's any, magic way to put that in its place. But the first step is always just watching, because for me, I had full identity, as of 10 years ago or 5 years ago, even, I think I would have said, I am Chris. I am this one thing. And I could have written some stuff down and said, here's how I respond. favorably and unfavorably. You know, these things make me happy, these make me sad. And it would have been that sort of a description. Now I understand that I can watch my mind as a tool, chattering away, ascribing meaning to things, you know, reinforcing the belief systems it wants to. And I'm alert to the idea that my ego is constantly in search of things that validate its existence. And so it's always on the hunt for information that supports its worldview. And to me, that's a dangerous thing to have. Part of the reason that I want to have some separation, have the ego and the mind as a tool rather than, you know, as the complete driver of the ship, is because I don't trust it. Or I do. I trust it to go out and do what it does, which is to reinforce itself, engage in confirmation bias, watch for what it wants to watch for, ignore the rest, and do all of that. And I think those are useful activities, but they're absolutely not to be trusted to be driving the whole ship. As well, you know, I've discovered that as I start to step into this territory where I get to begin to, and this was a really key thing for me, was learning I get to choose.
What do you get to choose?
I get to choose. So somebody asked me this, you know, it was in the comment section, because I said, you know, the more I've started to step into this mission, and the more I begin to trust that and have faith that in that, I've noticed that everything I need is showing up. And somebody said in the comments, well, then you have confirmation bias because you're just seeing what you want to see again. And, you know, you're just fooling yourself. I'm like, well, that's okay with me. And here's why. Because I'm now when I go to a large seminar, there might be, you know, 100 to 1,000 people there. I'm not there to meet the person I think I'm there to meet. I'm there to meet somebody or several somebodies. I don't know, but I'm curious now and I'm open because I have this idea that if I'm open, the next person I need to meet will show up. And that's been happening. And when I step into that, I become much more open because I say yes to things now rather than, my ego trying to figure out, you know, can I serve you? Can you do something for me? Is it going to be transactional? Now I can just feel into it and go, yes, I want to meet this person. And because of that, I have this gratitude because I feel like the things are just showing up in my life. But is it because they really are? Because, you know, now I've done this law of attraction and they're showing up because I'm open to that? Or is it that I'm finally able to see them? Because I'm open to seeing them, because I'm no longer slave to what I was expecting to see, right? I don't care. Doesn't matter. Either way it's running. I don't care. Because what the net result for me is I have a lot of gratitude. I'm really full of excitement. I'm really curious about what's happening now. I no longer have an expectation of what's going to happen as much. And so it's, you know, that's been the process for me. But first I had to understand that I wasn't Chris, this thing, which was really a full containment of ego running everything. The sense that I'm just a single unitary device called Chris. Now I understand that I have all these different parts and pieces, and I can separate and witness and step into this more fully.
Okay. Great. So, all right. Just looking at the time here in my role as time cop, we're approaching the 15 minutes left mark. So we still have some time. We also just ran our first poll and I saw everybody jumped on it quickly. So thank you for that, folks. I'm still here on the administrative side, learning how to use all the tools we have here. So I appreciate you folks rolling with me here while I figure them out in real time. But that being said, let's move on to a question that is sort of a perennial favorite. This comes from Dan. When I teach people about the crash course, they tend to either blow it off or end up depressed over it. What are some practical things you recommend doing to address this? And if we can weave into here as well, you know, how do you bring this material to people who don't necessarily aren't necessarily looking to hear it when you bring it to them?
Yeah, well, one thing I want to say is that we address this really deeply, usually at our seminars at Rowe. And Chris and I just recently recorded a podcast on this subject, which I think it's going to get put out in the next few weeks or so. So, you know, while we'll address this very topically now, just because we don't have a whole lot of time, we do spend an entire hour talking about it. And we talk about it in terms of how do we speak to a reluctant, we call them partners. It could be coworkers, friends, family, you know, anybody. a reluctant listener, maybe is a better way to talk about it. And it's challenging because when we're sharing something that's so important to us that we think that everybody else really, really, really needs to know, frequently what happens is we get kind of stirred up when we're talking about it. And so when we're talking about the material that like, I mean, especially when it's kind of in the survival camp, like, no, you really need to know this. And if you're going to make it through this dark time, you really need to know this. Wow, that's going to bring up a lot of emotion in somebody. And what we found in general, and Chris and I have our own story about this, but is that when you come at somebody with information in a charged way, what's going to happen is people are going to back up. They're going to back up or they're going to shut down. So the very, very first thing that we ask people to do when you're talking about the crash course or any of this material with people is to, number one, just, I would say, ground in gratitude. Get grounded, get stabilized yourself, breathe, and do it as calmly as you can, and have no expectation, honestly, of how they're going to receive it, because you can't do anything about that. It's really out of your control. So if your friends are, shutting down or just saying, I don't buy it, there's not a lot you can do about that. It might take some time for it to go in. One of the other things that we refer to is that in order for challenging material to really find a landing place in another person, it needs to be received from a trusted source, which may or may not be you. That trusted source might be like, I need to hear that on TV. I need to hear that from my spiritual teacher. I need to hear that from my sister. I need to hear it from my doctor. Whatever the authority figure is in somebody's life that says, oh, if that person says it, then I will believe it so. So frequently, if the information is not coming from what that person considers to be a trusted source, it's just not going to have a landing place in them.
And understand that when you're sharing the crash course, you're not sharing a bunch of information. You're shaking up somebody's worldview. You're challenging their beliefs, which means that the actual request that's being made when you ask somebody to sit down and eat, a giant buffet of what seems like information, you're actually asking them to go on a fairly tumultuous emotional journey if they're not there yet. That's the real request. Mm-hmm. And so to Becca's point, when you make a request of somebody to go into emotional territory, you got to be really respectful of exactly where they are already. Yep. And not require, expect, demand, or otherwise be forcing them to be different somewhere other than where they are. So it starts with compassion, really. And again, a lot of material around this. It's a great question. It's something we spend a lot of time on, because whether you're trying to get somebody to watch the crash course, or you're trying to influence a big family decision, or whether you're selling used cars, the tools are the same, really. It's a really important life tool, which is, or giving a big presentation at work. It's about how do we influence people? And it took me forever to figure out that we don't influence people with information. We influence them by understanding their emotional state and providing information in a way that allows them to navigate that in whatever. So everybody's got a different pace and different capacities. And by the way, some people aren't going to be built for understanding the story ever, because they're just not, you talked about wiring earlier, Adam. The wiring is just really difficult for some people. And we're a special tribe here at Peak Prosperity with a lot of highly, curious, but I would say people with very high capacities to deal with things that other people don't have the same capacity for. And that means we've got sort of a superpower, as you will, if we can look at it that way, but it's got to be managed carefully.
Yeah. And just remember that sometimes you need to just plant the seed of the idea and then back away, give them space, check in a month. Hey, have you thought about that? Have you seen anything in the news or in your world that might confirm this idea? Just give it time and just keep, pulsing into it a bit without like blasting them all at once with the information.
I'm glad you brought up the planting seeds analogy, Becca. I mean, we talk about that a lot, both in our seminars and at the site. And oftentimes what you're doing is you're planting that seed that's there basically to incubate until they get the information from a trusted source or have something that then shifts their belief system, and then that all of a sudden gives the seed the nourishment it needs to start sprouting. And you guys have a funny story that you tell at Row usually about some gentleman that came to one of your very earliest, kind of church basement seminars, Chris. And do you want to tell that one super briefly?
Yeah. So this was in the early days of the seminars. And by the way, they were awful. Just terrible. 8 hours of slides and such.
A lot of data.
Yeah. A lot of data.
Charts, graphs.
Yeah. Anyway, I got a knock at the door one day. I opened the door. I didn't even recognize the gentleman. And he said, "Hey, I just need to tell you, you're right." I was like, "About what?" He said, "What you said in that seminar." I'm like, "When?" He said, 2 years ago. Remember? I was at this, didn't remember. But he came to a seminar 2 years before, and finally it had gestated and settled, and he'd hunted me down on how he got my address. But he'd figured it all out and came and just wanted to let me know that it had finally sprouted. Yeah. And so that's great. And Beck and I talk about this in the longer podcast too. But when you plant a seed, you can, there are ones that you can pick that have a very high probability of sprouting, right? Like, someday oil prices are going to go a lot higher. Plant. Just wait. 2 years later, when that comes true, that person might come around and say, "Hey, how'd you know that?"
Right.
Oh, well, here's how I knew.
Oh man, there's so many good questions on this side. I want to answer them all.
Well, I'm going to go to the one that I've been wanting to ask for a while. And since we're beginning to run out of time here, people seem to be quite interested in this. But it's basically, how do we be with our children around this information? And I would try to maybe break that into two parts. I think sort of some of the general being, life tips, life hacks that you guys are talking about here to be a more fully authentic person, but also, around lots of the sort of scary information and stuff that we deal with here at Peak Prosperity. How should people be with their children? How have you guys been with your children? What works and what do you advise? Yeah.
Well, obviously this it really depends on the age of your children. Young children, just be with them. None of this information is important to them. They don't need to know a darn thing. But honestly, what we did was we just wove in the doing that we were doing, the gardening, the chickens, the bees, the community, like that just became woven into their life, so that the doing response to the scary information was just a part of their life. It wasn't like, oh my gosh, the world's going to end, so that's why we have to grow our own food. It's just, oh, that's what we do in our family. We grow some of our food, and I want you to come out, and this is part of your chores, by the way. So the doing is woven into the family structure. That's one of the things that we have. With older children, I mean, honestly, while of course we can look at this as a time with fear and darkness, personally, I see this as a very exciting time to be alive, because we're living in a time of massive change. And I would introduce it that way to the kids. Like, you know what? Guess what? You are alive at a very exciting time in history. And when things are moving and changing, sometimes we don't know how it's going to go. And sometimes it feels scary, and sometimes it feels really fun, like a roller coaster. Sometimes you're terrified and sometimes it's a blast. Like, that's kind of what it's like when we're going through periods of big change. And so I think that the altitude that you talk about the material is really important. If you're down, I like to use the metaphor of being down at the stormy sea. If you're down at the level of the waves, and you're getting bashed by the waves, and the waves might be all of the scary information, all of the data on climate change, on, potential social unrest, on all of this kind of stuff, like that material can be very scary. But if you rise up a little bit and you look maybe through a historical lens and look through different periods of change over time, and just say, hey, guess what? We happen to be living at one of these periods of change, and these are some of the things that can come along with it. But really, go ahead. What you want to say, hon?
If you haven't seen it, there's a movie called Captain Fantastic.
Oh God.
And it's about homeschooling.
Yeah,
and there's a scene in
not real homeschooling.
Well, not real, but there's a scene in there I love where he's on the bus and his youngest daughter is asking questions about sex, and he answers them just directly.
Yeah.
Just straight. And the point here is that when your children are asking you a question, you either answer it directly or you risk becoming irrelevant in this story, because they already know, they're already getting this information from all over the place. So this idea that we can hide or otherwise couch, I would, my advice, very strong advice, is answer questions truthfully, simply, and directly. Again, without a lot of the emotion. You don't want to be bringing your fear into this, or we're all, but just if they have a question, answer it. And that's part one. And in my story around how this can sort of sneak in by osmosis, 10-year-old story. My kids were, at that point, I believe they would have been 13 and 9 and 7.
Okay.
And they had just gotten some family stock. My family's from a long line of banking people, and they gotten a few shares of the family stock, which was a small regional bank in upstate New York, and they'd gotten their first dividend check. So we're about to have one of those big, exciting moments where first I have to explain how money shows up magically in the mail. They liked that part. And I remember this from my own childhood, was going to open a bank account, so I'm like, this is really exciting. You get the little passbook and your money goes into the bank. It's all grown up. So I announced this whole thing. I say, hey, we're going to go down to the bank. We're going to open bank accounts. And I get ready to be bowled over by 3 kids running out the door. And it's just chirping crickets around the dinner table. And the oldest one says, what if the bank goes bankrupt? And the middle child said, I think I'd rather have silver.
That's right. Yeah.
And the youngest one said, yeah, silver. So they all went into silver instead. And we hadn't talked to them.
Not directly, nope.
About bankruptcy, money, any of that stuff. But our conversations had all gone in by osmosis. So the story is really that if you think you're hiding stuff from your kids, you're not. Somehow it's going in.
Well, we just talked about that stuff, but again, this was the key. It wasn't that we were freaking out about it. It wasn't that we were talking about it in fear. It was just kind of matter of fact, like, well, this is the situation. We know that the banks can fail at any time. So we want to make sure that we're, have our assets in different places. And it's like, what are the emotions that we are bringing to the conversation? That's the most important thing with the kids. And I'm seeing that we are almost out of time here.
Almost out of time here. But, look, as somebody who is, knows your kids and spent time with them. I mean, your kids are well-adjusted, happy kids. They live their lives with a sense of adventure. They're not living in fear.
No.
In fact, they've got, I think, a lot more life skills than the average kid out there. And what I've seen is you guys have done exactly what you've said, where you've kind of taught them the rules of the world. And, as long as they know what those rules are, they can figure out how to put those rules to their advantage or live into them. So, I feel like you've kind of practicing exactly what you're preaching here, but, just looking, from a distance at how your kids have turned out, they are fully formed, fully functional, happy kids.
They are. And we just our youngest actually dropped her off on a plane this morning, and she's going to Costa Rica for a month. Harder time for mom. She was like, woo, see ya, but
it's a rite of passage.
Yep. Off they go. And you're right. Very fully formed. Thank you. And they're just wonderful and fully able to deal in all of that, but not facing the future with a sense of doom and gloom at all.
No, but there's it's reality.
Concerned, but I don't know anybody who's paying attention who doesn't share that. So yeah, it's really, challenging environment, I think, we
should do a whole podcast on
probably
this.
Should.
Is a big one.
Yeah.
Great. Well, look, we're going to start winding down here. First off, I just want to thank everybody who's participated. I think this has been another success, and definitely very excited to do more of these going forward. Seems like the audience is too, from that quick poll we ran. I'm now just activating a reminder here that we've got another webinar coming up on June 7th. This one is going to be a real dive into the knowing side of things. It's going to be with some of the world's top experts on the Federal Reserve, and we're really going to be rolling up our sleeves and diving into what are the central banks likely to do next, and what are those repercussions going to be. So for all those folks who asked questions about the economy, gold and silver, future of the dollar, all that stuff, that's the one you guys are going to want to register for. That one is a paid webinar, given the fact that we're having to bring in talent for it. If you'll notice here on the little promo I've just put up, anybody who registers as a result of this webinar we'll give an immediate refund to 15%, just a little additional kicker there to sign up for it. But that's sure to be an excellent seminar. And that one is going to be pretty meaty. I think it's going to be about a 2.5, 3 hour seminar. So get ready to sit down and get some knowledge during that one. As we begin to wind down here for this seminar, as Chris and Becca said, we've got a lot more content that's being created around this being part of the spectrum, including a number of podcasts that they mentioned. And so those will be coming out on the site over the next couple of weeks, and we'll tell you where to look out for them. As we kind of wrap things up, Chris and Becca, what would you like folks to sort of take away in terms of how to process this conversation once we log off here and they await some of the new content that's going to be coming out soon?
Well, the first thing I would like to do is give Becca a chance to talk about her website and the service that she offers, because I know a lot of people came with very personal questions that would not be appropriate to really address, in a venue like this. But
well, if you want to explore my website right now, it's ChrisMartensondotcom, and I do personal coaching and counseling of a variety of subjects, so feel free to poke around there. But what I really want to leave people with is my own belief that the capacity to be fully alive, to be engaged, to feel joy every day is totally possible even in the darkest times. And in fact, this is what we're being called to. So welcome the full experience of your life, and this is a grand adventure. I hope you can live that way.
I just want to say that after having been at this for 10 years, I'm really very excited at this moment in time. And rather than feeling like we've been dragging a sled across dry ground for 10 years and getting nowhere. Because the truth is, let's be clear, peak prosperity and all of our combined efforts still amount to zero when we round to the nearest whole number. And that doesn't bother me at this point because I can feel an enormous shift coming. And I know that we all have a role in that. And this opening myself up has been both vulnerable and a little scary, but also extremely rewarding. And so I'm just very excited to be on revealing this part and engaging in this part and starting to meet people on this level. And the only downside to it is I can't tolerate small talk anymore.
He's terrible. Don't take him to a party.
I'll be like, let's get real. And which can be fun. So with that, just very excited at this point, believe it or not.
Great. Well, great words. And just in conclusion, really excited about the webinar platform because looking at some of the comments here, it seems to really inject a little bit more of a sense of interaction. We get that in our annual seminars, but those are usually only once a year and people have to travel pretty far to get them. I'm really hopeful that this new technology solution here will let us inject a little bit more of that into our regular ongoings here at Peak Prosperity and let us have a little bit more close connection and intimacy with the crowd here. So thank you, everybody. It's everybody too. So we're gonna hang up here, but everybody who's been here will get a video, an email with a link to a replay video of this conversation. So if points were made and you don't quite remember them, you want to rewatch the video, you can to your heart's content. And with that said, we'll see you guys on the site, and we will see you in hopefully a future webinar too. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.